Good evening and welcome to Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. My name is Claire Haley. I'm the Vice President of Programs and Public Relations for Atlanta History Center. It is absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all in the audience this evening and our very two special guests, authors Heather Webb and Allison Pataki. They will both be discussing their new releases, two wonderful books. Such a great time to be discussing them. Women's fiction, women's historical fiction during Women's History Month. So I really love that we were able to put together this program with them. As Heather and Allison are talking this evening, the Q&A will be open. We'll close the chat in a few moments, but the Q&A will be open. So if you have questions for either or both of them, please feel free to drop that in the Q&A, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end where we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So please remember to ask your questions so we're able to get to it. Also, both novels will be on sale this evening. Heather's is The Next Ship Home, a novel of Ellis Island. That'll be available. There it is, beautiful cover. For sale from Atlanta History Center's museum shop. I'll post a link to do that once these two ladies begin talking. It'll be 25% off tonight only. And if you buy from us, you will get a nice signed book plate from Heather to adorn your book. So make sure you do that. We have in-store pickup and domestic US shipping. Allison's book is The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post, a novel, also a beautiful cover. Her book will be for sale from Foxtail Bookshop, which is located up in Woodstock, and they have some signed copies available. So links for both of those will be in the chat here shortly. So I think given all the action in the chat, these two ladies need very little introduction, but Heather is the USA Today bestselling and award-winning author of 7 historical novels. Her work has won many awards, including Rodden's Lover being a Goodreads top pick, and Last Christmas in Paris winning the Women's Fiction Writers Association Star Award. To date, Heather's books have been translated into over a dozen languages. She lives in New England with her family and one feisty rabbit. And she's joining us virtually here in Atlanta tonight. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Allison Pataki is a writer of adult fiction, adult nonfiction, and children's books, and her work has been translated into 20 languages and is popular in many, many countries throughout the world. She's written for the New York Times, ABC News, Huffington Post, among many other publications, and appearing on many many shows you probably have seen. Today's show, Good Morning America. And again, her book is The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. Welcome, Allison. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to be here in conversation with Heather Webb, which is such an honor and a treat. I have had the privilege of meeting Heather one other time in person for a fabulous conversation for Ribbons of Scarlet, your book about the French Revolution. But then we've crossed paths many times on the internet and in the wonderful world of this virtual writers community. And so when you read a book you really love, the biggest treat of all is to be able to have a direct line on Zoom to the author of that book to get to talk about it. So I absolutely loved this book, The Next Ship Home.
Thank you.
Personally so moving, but also just such an important story for Americans and women and just people all over the world. Will you just give us sort of your 35,000 foot view of what this story is and sort of, what it means to you in your journey to publishing this book?
Sure. So thank you. And I love seeing you again, first of all. Very fun. Too bad it's not in person, but I'll take the Zoom. So
next time.
Yeah. So The Next Ship Home is it's a novel of Ellis Island. It's a place that I have held in my memory and in my heart for about maybe 15 years. I was a high school teacher. I taught French, but I accompanied a Spanish trip to New York City as a chaperone. One of our stops was actually at Ellis Island, and I'd never been. And so as I walked through the halls, I was just really riveted by this place. I was fascinated by sort of the feeling of it and the stories there. And so this is kind of where this book began. Years later, I remembered that trip. It was so impressionable. And I decided that I really wanted a character that worked at Ellis Island, and then a character that went through Ellis Island, so that you got a really nice juxtaposition of perspectives. So the book itself is 1902, New York City, turn of the century. You have the subway being built. You have Theodore Roosevelt has just stepped in as president because McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. You have thousands of immigrants arriving on the shore every single week. And so our main characters are moving through this backdrop. We have Francesca Ricci, who moves from Sicily with her sister and is hoping for this better life. And she ends up at Ellis Island and things do not go according to plan. And she makes an unlikely friendship with a German-American woman whose family runs a beer house in the tenement neighborhood in the Lower East Side. And very soon they decide to come together to face down the corruption that is rippling through the halls of Ellis Island. So this is sort of what the book is about. You've got this very interesting, massively growing city and country as the backdrop. You've got really radically shifting populations with all the immigrants coming in. And then you have a lot of corruption happening at a small level and a larger one at Ellis Island from the top down.
Yeah. That was one of the things that really struck me immediately about your book is, we hear New York being the Empire State, as you said, thousands of immigrants flooding through. It's the land of opportunity. They can come to America and flee from oppression and come and have opportunity. But you do not shy away in this book from showing really some of the dark underbelly moments, and they are based in true history. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
How you decided, what to do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to just say, for people that are always a little afraid of something dark, I always try to weave a whole lot of hope through my stories because I believe in hope. And I think that that's still there, and there's still that sense of America is a refuge. Yeah. But there's another side to every story, like every single story out there, right? And I love that you picked up on that. So I started out by going to Ellis Island many times, actually, meeting with the librarian, getting to know some of the basics of the layout, and just, all the different sort of decades at Ellis Island. You have about 6.5 decades that it was open. And every 5 years or so, it was a huge shift in the people that were coming through and the things that were happening there. The laws were changing so constantly. So I chose this very specific period because I was digging in the New York Times archives and I found these articles about a chief inspector who kept coming up as a man who was less than above board. And in fact, when I stumbled upon an article about the 40 people that were either working with companies that provided food and shipping, et cetera, to Ellis Island, or worked at the island itself, and they were led by this man, John Ledgerhilder, 40 of them were hauled before a grand jury in New York in 1902 in the fall. And when I saw this, it was like I went, okay, this is my framework. Now I'm going to walk myself back and figure out what was happening this whole year. There's a wonderful book called American Passage by Vince Cannato, and he details this, a bit more. So I just sort of dug into all of that and thought, this is all going on, and none of us know this. We just think of, the Statue of Liberty and the freedom, and we knew that jobs weren't always, the streets were not paved with gold, and we knew that the jobs were not always amazing jobs. But I did not, I should say, really know how much people were taking advantage of the immigrants coming over. And it was intense.
Exactly.
And no, I did not shy away. I really wanted to show, some sort of bust some of those myths, I guess.
Right. So this, An American Tale, right? The Fievel movie. This is all you need to know, everything about the full picture of the immigrant experience. But as you said, one of the major places of redemption and hope that you find in this story is in your amazing characters and in their relationships. And in particular, one female relationship that you do such a beautiful job of developing. And I just have to read a sentence you wrote because it was so beautiful. I dog-eared it and I just loved it. And you said, no one, there are two women who are speaking. It's an older woman and one, as you said, Francesca, your Italian immigrant woman. And the older woman says, no one understands what a woman in difficult times must bear except another woman in the same situation. I thought I'd learned better than to assume things about people given my background, but I had not completely. You taught me that, Francesca. So it's March, it's Women's History Month. I loved this thread of the story about the women and the female relationships. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, we are women, so of course we're drawn to writing about these relationships. And it's not that men don't have really beautiful, strong relationships with people, but they're just so different from those between women. I think, sort of being in history, being the one that has had to really, really work hard and strive and beat down the chains, so to speak, just like a lot of the minorities that are working so hard today to take their rightful place with everyone else. I think that, those relationships are more important than almost anything else, because it's someone lending you a hand exactly when you need it. And we all need that. And so I just wanted to explore that and look a little bit into the definition of family and how, you might be born with a certain family, but we also have a family that we make in our lives of our choosing with friends. And I hope that is reflected in the pages here, where you can see that Francesca has left everything.
Yes.
And she's really kind of seeking another family. And Alma has her own, without spoilers, Alma has her own version of recreating her family. So that was another aspect of the female friendship that I wanted to dig into too.
Yeah, so beautifully said, especially with both of them just being in this new place, and the family that you have to weave, and having no support system. You get the sense that with the immigrant experience, they are in this new place. They have to build this new family for themselves as they're building this life. And so you have this amazing author's note in the back of the book where you talk about your research and you talk about your story. And you included a fact that blew me away, which is that from 1892 to 1954, 12 million immigrants passed through the halls of Ellis Island. And this is what shocked me. Even today, 50% of Americans can trace at least one ancestor through that immigration center. I had no idea. So can you just talk a little bit about the research you did with Ellis Island and things you uncovered?
Yes.
And if you had a personal, have you found any family members of yours who came through Ellis Island, and just what that meant, that in that number of years, that many people came to America and just changed the country?
It's kind of shocking still, isn't it? It's not exactly 50. I think maybe I should have edited that. I think it's between 40 and 50, but that's enormous.
For half of the people.
400 million people. Yeah. And I just thought, how is it that when I saw these statistics and I started thinking about writing this, how is it that many people have links to Ellis Island and there aren't books written about it?
Exactly.
And what's interesting is going through the submission process and trying to get this book published, there are a lot of people that said, people don't care about Ellis Island. They don't want to read this. We're not going to publish this.
How can that be?
And I just thought, how can that be? Everyone that has talked about their ancestry and their grandparents or their great grandparents or their husband's parents or their, whoever. And I just found that so amazing. And so that was a big part of me starting off with this, is I just thought, this is a huge part of who we are as Americans. Even if it's not directly linked to your family, it's a cornerstone of our society. Immigration is true to all of us.
Right.
Or most of us, the vast majority of us. So,
right.
So that to me was a huge draw. And I just started digging in, and I couldn't let go. There was too many fascinating things that happened there. And I just thought so many, the bravery, the courage it takes to leave your home, your nation, everything behind. I could relate a little bit too. I'm a former military brat. I moved 13 times as a kid. And when you leave that many times and you start over that many times and you are new that often, you can look at what these immigrants have done and maybe relate a tiny bit and go, I can see the kind of bravery it takes. I wanted to explore that too, just personally myself. And I just really got, sort of hooked in. But in terms of my research, so yeah, I did spend a lot of time at Ellis Island. I've been out probably a dozen times. I've taken tons of videos. I've done every tour, every, headset, all the stuff. And spoke with the librarian a whole lot, as I mentioned before. And then just took videos. It was fun to just walk around and take videos so I could really get a sense of, how big it is and where it is in juxtaposition to Manhattan and New Jersey and all of that stuff. And then I started looking at immigrant interviews. So there's a thing called the Oral History Project, and many interviews have been conducted over the last 60, 70 years where they were transmitted all into type, and a lot of them are bound into various copies. But at Ellis Island, there is, you can access some of this stuff too. And some of them are also recorded, they're audio files. And I loved those especially because you could hear the voices and all the emotion, and they would just get so choked up about, having this chance to start again. They're fleeing war or famine or persecution, and just really major reasons to come here, and many of them. And I can't tell you, I'm doing this because I can't tell you how often I got choked up listening to those and reading those. And that just really solidified my love for this topic. I couldn't let go of it. And I'm so glad that my agent kept, do it. We're going to place this book. People are going to want to read about this. And here we are. And it's been really wonderful to see that people are connecting to the book. Yeah. So
it is shocking that people told you that it was not something that people would be interested in. So I just have to say, personally, my dad, all 4 of his grandparents came through Ellis Island, 2 of them from Hungary, because they had nothing, they were fleeing. 1 from Ireland. And the first thing she saw when she stepped onto Manhattan soil was a job opening, and it said Irish need not apply. And then and then his grandfather from Reggio Calabria. So from the same, area of Italy where Francesca's coming from. And the stories are just, they're so rich and they're so meaningful. And so thank you. I say that, personally as an Ellis Island, I wouldn't be here if not for Ellis Island. And I just want to ask you, so then you have all this history and the raw material and the inspiration. So then how did you conceive of your characters and weave the fiction in with the facts?
So I tend to choose, I either figure out the event or sort of the era in the event. And then when I'm doing something with a fictional character, because these are not real, most of them are not real characters. And then I decide on people who would have the most trouble in that situation, because you don't have a story if you don't have, sort of struggling to figure out who they are and how to get out of this situation or how to make the most of it. And so I really like to think about, who would be the most challenged in this situation. And that's how I started. And I knew that at that time, I found this article about how people just detested the Italians. Well, my mother's Italian, her whole family's Italian American. And so it was kind of like, what? We love Italians. Right. We love Italian culture. We love Italy. We love, as Americans now. And the food, it was just a really shocking thing to discover. Yeah. And so that started me on that round. But yeah, I think that you just kind of have to choose a character that makes sense in whatever setting that you're working on. Yeah. And, obviously sometimes I write true to life characters too, like you do, but not always. And this was really fun to stray from that path.
And so these women just sort of emerged for you. They just made themselves known to you.
Yeah. Now Alma, my German American was harder. She was harder. I didn't hear her voice as loudly as I heard Francesca's. Francesca is a very strong character. And I think I share some similarities with her personally. And so she was easier, but at the same time, Alma has this love of language. She's my German American. And I was a high school French and Spanish teacher. And so I love culture, I love language, and Alma's sort of my ode to that, I think. And she wants to be a translator. And of course, they're not female translators back then. And so you see this sort of struggle to move up in that position. And so they both filled sort of different needs, I think.
Yeah. I felt like I could see you in Alma, and you did a good job, like your love of language. And yes, you did a very good job of making her desire.
Thank you. And they're also nothing like me. You know how that goes. You you find little tiny sparks of yourself in every character, and then things that are just so absolutely nothing like you, but that's fun.
Yeah.
That's the fun of it, right?
In a direction you never expected.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Allison, I'm gonna turn the tables here. I think I want to talk about your book.
Okay, great.
It's time. And I already saw a question in the comments here. They were asking about the grape nuts. So we're gonna get to that.
Which I have here.
Which you have there.
I don't have my book, but I have my grape nuts.
So I have your book. I would just like to say, first of all, you guys, this is a gorgeous book. I'm about halfway through it, and I started it 3 days ago, and I've had, unfortunately, terrible insomnia, but I'm like ripping through this in the middle of the night, and it makes me not want to go to bed.
I'm so sorry and happy to hear that.
This woman, so Marjorie Post, is a magnificently fascinating character. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Absolutely.
And we want to hear about Marjorie.
Yeah, so I say Marjorie Merriweather Post was like the Forrest Gump of the 20th century, in that she had a front row seat to all of this history and an active hand in shaping these moments we all know about. But she had way better houses and way better clothing. She was the woman who built Mar-a-Lago. She was like this fabulous, she was the first United States ambassadress to the Soviet Union. Like you, her story sort of begins with this close personal friendship that she and her family had with President Teddy Roosevelt. But who Marjorie Merriweather Post was, she was the heir and the sole, child of the Post food empire. So the family company that gives us grape nuts, the family that gave us the concept of cereal, just in general, and the concept of this ready-made breakfast. And so they start from nothing. They're in Battle Creek, Michigan, because her father has been a patient of Dr. Harvey Kellogg at the Kellogg Sanitarium in Michigan. And her father, C.W. Post, has this sort of miraculous recovery from his ailments. And he pitches to Dr. Harvey Kellogg, this stuff that you serve at the SAN, this granola cereal stuff that you give to your patients, this could really be big. This could be something you could take to a broader market. And the rumor has it that Dr. Harvey Kellogg laughs C.W. Post off the campus and says, this cereal stuff, I serve it to my patients, but it would never actually take off in any real way. So C.W. Post takes the idea and he runs with it. He markets and pitches cereal to the American public, and the rest is, history, as we can say.
History, as they say.
We do eat cereal. So Marjorie comes of age with this family empire that grows and fundamentally reshapes the American way of life and this diet. And then it's what she does with the millions that are earned by that, correct business assumption by her father that really makes for her interesting, colorful, historic life.
So I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
First is a very silly one. So Kellogg was a doctor, and there are Kellogg's.
Yes. So
are Kellogg's Post cereals?
So
or they no?
The Kellogg's saw C.W. Post's success with grape nuts and with Postum and with Toasties, a few of their earliest products. And then the Kellogg's said, oh, dang, he was right. C.W. Post was correct. This cereal stuff really does have potential in a broader market beyond just what we're serving in our hospital. And so then they launched the Kellogg's company. And we all know, obviously, Kellogg's cornflakes and whatnot. So the Post and the Kellogg's were then bitter, lifelong rivals. And, the Kellogg's always thought the Posts were kind of interlopers who took their idea. And the Posts kind of thought, well, you were never going to do anything with this. And you didn't own this concept of cereal. And we actually made it an industry that changed America. So Marjorie would have bristled at the idea that, her father took anyone's idea. What she would have said is her father actually made it, happen. And then the Kellogg's kind of jumped in and got in on the race.
So this is a random question before we get back to Marjorie. Not random. Have you had grape nuts? It is like gravel.
It's like gravel, so I get the flakes. I get the flakes because I don't actually like grape nuts cereal. So Marjorie, it's funny. Marjorie went on to do amazing things with her life. And one of the things she did was she became this great collector of Imperial Russian treasure because she lived in Moscow during the like in the lead up to World War II and the Cold War. And so the Soviets were just getting rid of their treasure because it had belonged to the czars. They saw no sentimental or historic significance in the provenance. The czars were shameful, centuries worth of thievery from the people. So they were willing to sell all of this treasure to the highest bidder. And Marjorie's there and she has cash and she loves art. So she's willing to be the highest bidder. So Marjorie scoops up Catherine the Great's China tea service. She scoops up Anastasia's diamonds. And so this is so funny. So Marjorie is America's empress. She lives in her homes like Mar-a-Lago. She's eating her breakfast off of Catherine the Great, the Tsarina's Russian china. And what is she eating every morning? She's eating grape nuts off of Catherine the Great's china. So that just sums Marjorie up.
She's got family dedication.
She's got dedication, and she's this wonderful, like, complex dichotomy of high elegance and sophistication and privilege, but just always to the end was this salty, down to earth, keeping it real Midwestern girl, who remembered her roots.
So, okay. So now we want to hear more about her. So that's all fascinating. She's got these diamonds. She's got this tea set.
Yeah.
She has no luck in love. And I would say on one hand that's because she's a lover and she's looking for romance and she's looking for that thing. And she's having trouble finding it or maybe she falls in love easily. Yeah. She's had 4 husbands.
Yeah.
I'm sure that did not help her reputation.
Right.
Especially then. That's so hard. It's bad enough now, but very difficult then. I want to hear a little bit about this and tell us more about Marjorie in general.
I love everything you said. All of that is so spot on. So that was one of the first things I learned about Marjorie was the food empire, the Russian treasure, and being this great philanthropist and art collector, and the 4 very dramatic, juicy, very different love stories. And for me, that was one of the things that humanized Marjorie, because yes, she lived this fantastic life, but she had this heartache that just showed the vulnerability. She was a human like all of us. And I loved that she was willing to keep trying and to keep giving her heart another chance to fall in love. And every time you root and you're like, this could be the one, this
is the guy,
happy soulmate. And then you see all 4 marriages fall apart in these big dramatic ways. And they're all so different. But
I was just going to say that too. They're vastly different from each other.
And it was really not something that was done or even approved of by society in the time that Marjorie was getting married and getting divorced. As you said, it was really kind of shocking that she would even get divorced 1 time, let alone 4 times. But if you follow the progression of, the first husband, who's sort of this waspy, did not come through Ellis Island. He was one of the 400 who settled Manhattan with, going back centuries. You kind of can follow the line through from him to then the second husband, who is E.F. Hutton, one of the founders of what we would know as Lehman Brothers, this dashing financier. And the rumor was that Marjorie and E.F. Hutton, in the heyday of their romance, the 1920s, we're talking Long Island and Manhattan, jazz age, roaring 20s, that they were the inspiration.
Very glamorous.
Very glamorous. And they were purportedly the inspiration for The Great Gatsby. Their lifestyle was just so grand and larger than life. And they were hanging out with people like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Florence Ziegfeld. And so then that, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to give away spoilers, but that one is just a disaster and an epic heartbreak. And he was really her soulmate, they think. And then she goes next to this sort of dark, handsome diplomat, this man of politics, and he's Joseph Davies. He's in the Roosevelt administration, and it's with him that she has this fantastic, epic European adventure at the beginning of World War II, where they're sent to Europe They are part of Roosevelt's administration. She's the first United States ambassadress to the Soviet Union. Her goal is to keep Stalin from making an alliance with Hitler. It's just like really significant history here. And then you see what happens with that one. And then the fourth marriage is this bon vivant, kind of sophisticated, artistic, cultured man. And you think, oh, this is her soulmate. This is her, they're finally like, they're such great companions. And then that one ends in this shocking, scandalous way. So keeps us on our toes. We keep hoping for her. We keep rooting for her. And where I found like the hope and sort of the silver lining through each of these heartbreaks was that Marjorie's going to be okay through each one. She gets a little bit stronger. This is really not the story of a woman who was a wife behind a great man. This is the story of the woman who was front and center stage of her own life story. And ultimately that life story is one that's filled with love, even though it's not the romantic Prince Charming we might hope for, but like she has 3 daughters. One of her daughters is Dina Merrill, the wonderful movie star. Her other 2 daughters are fascinating characters. And she has this beautiful, rich life, even though she has these heartaches along the way.
So I hate to admit this as someone who loves history, and I feel like I read so much about it all the time. I had never heard of her.
Right.
How did this happen? Did you read something? Did you visit sort of a landmark, or how did you find the topic?
Absolutely. So I'm sure that you have this situation where people know you write historical novels, and so you're always getting tips, right? And people are like, "Oh, you should look into this person.
You should write about this person." Yes.
Yeah. So I met a mutual friend of my mother-in-law's, and this woman, Nancy, was from Washington, D.C., Nancy Harris, and she had served as an oral historian at Hillwood, which is now a museum, but which had been Marjorie's final home in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
When Marjorie passed away, she knew she had lived a life that was unlike anything most people can even imagine. And she knew she had spent this lifetime amassing this treasure and this household that was really unique. And so she left it as a museum for the public to enjoy. She made plans for all of her homes. She wanted Mar-a-Lago to be the winter White House. She left Camp Topridge, her great Adirondack camp in upstate New York, to the state of New York. And she left Hillwood, her DC home, to be a museum. And so Nancy Harris, this friend of my mother-in-law's, had worked at Hillwood, and she said, you write these historical fiction novels about women. You should really go to Hillwood and look into the life of Marjorie Merriweather Post. And I will admit, at the time that she said it, I, like you, had not heard of her. I thought maybe Emily Post Manners books. I thought maybe she was related to that, or like a Post newspaper. There are a lot of Post newspapers out there.
Well, and you get the tips all the time. So you're like, oh, and there are things that you're already thinking about that you're drawn to. Yeah. So you're like, okay, maybe I'll stop by. Yeah. And then you went.
I went to Hillwood, and I was just bitten. I was gripped. You walk into Hillwood. This was 6 years ago. And Dina Merrill, her daughter, said it's as if Marjorie could walk in and sit down to dinner. That's just how well it's done and so tasteful and preserved. And if you get to a scene in the book where you're sitting down to dinner with Marjorie, that's high praise, because Marjorie literally measured every place setting with a ruler.
Oh, but wow.
Hillwood's just beautiful. And you go there and you see Jackie Kennedy's handwritten notes to her, and you see her pictures with Winston Churchill, and you see the like beautiful decor from Versailles and the jewelry from the Russian czars. And there was this great story where when Marjorie bought Hillwood, she was like, okay, I love it. I'm going to change it all. Cause that's what she did. Everything was done in her, to her perfect mind and planning. And so she walked in, and the architect told her, if you clear the trees of the landscaping and you move the panel doors, it would give you a view of the Washington Monument. And they said, but it's way too hard to move the panel doors because this is a load-bearing wall. So the rumor was that rather than have to move her paneling doors, Marjorie just moved the Washington Monument. And that's just the kind of lady that she was. And so you really get a sense of her spirit and just the richness of her life. And I was just obsessed. And I just couldn't believe, as you said about your own book, I couldn't believe that the fiction novel had not yet been written. And it was, my
You're like,
fortune.
how did someone not find
that.
this and dig into it? Yeah.
Right.
And I've never been to Hillwood. I've been to DC a million times. My parents used to live there.
Yeah.
And I have not heard of it or seen it. And now I'm absolutely going to go.
Great. Go when it's spring or summer, because she had the best gardens and grounds. And like, she had this really, in one of her very acrimonious divorces, when her husband, at the time, then became her ex-husband, got the DC home. The rumor was that in the night she sent in her gardeners by cover of darkness and ripped out some of her favorite azaleas and plants so she could transplant them in Hillwood. But she was intense. She was a fighter. Yeah, she was a saucy lady. She was not a shrinking violet.
Love it. Yeah. And I'm getting that only, and I'm like 100 pages in, and I love characters like this. So it's been very fun getting to know her.
Oh, thank you.
So you know what? We have a lot of questions here. So I think, you guys, I'm going to pause and turn this back over to Claire, who's the director, and let her go through the questions that we can chat with you guys and tell you what you would like to know.
Great.
Yeah, of course. And let me just start by saying that absolutely flew by. And I'm so fascinated by both of you and how much interesting things you have talked about. So I'm just going to start with this question because it's for both of you. And this is from Anissa. And she asks, what has been your most challenging character to write and why?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you start, Allison.
Without a doubt, Marjorie Merriweather Post. And the reason, there are a few reasons. Number one, she's the most recent history. I've written about a lot of women who've been dead for 300 years. And so there are huge gaping holes in the historical record. And with that, I would say there was just more liberty to lean into the fiction. Whereas this one, her home is a museum. There are teams of PhDs and scholars and archivists who their sole job is to preserve the information of her life. And so there is copious information. Her grandchildren who were present in some of these scenes are still alive and send me emails and we talk. And so I just felt this added sort of pressure to get it right. And to, even though I'm writing historical fiction, to pass the level of credibility that this story deserved. And also, I've worked on this book for 6 years. It's the longest it's ever taken me to write a book. I've never admired and liked a woman as much that I've spent so much time with, getting to know and researching and writing. And I told my editor, I could write 15 different books about Marjorie with 15 different story arcs that would each be complete novels. That's how many directions and details there are in her life. And so then it was just finding a story that wasn't going to be 1,000 pages and that told, the full complete arc as it came to me. So for that reason, for all of those reasons, Marjorie was my hardest character, but also feels special to me.
It's funny you say that because I can't actually disclose the hardest one that I've written about because I haven't announced it yet and it comes out next winter. But I will tell you this, it's a dual biographical and they're both fairly recent to history as well. For the same exact reasons you're talking about, their lives were documented within an inch. I mean, everything they said and did, everyone they knew, it was documented. And so it made it incredibly challenging to make sure, and their children are still alive. One of their children is still alive. So it's pressure. Tricky. You want to preserve their memory and you want to be respectful, but you also want to get it right. You want their voice to sound like them. You want to, and it's very, very challenging. And I really, really hope I manage to pull it off. So very soon I will be announcing that, but that's so my upcoming book definitely has the most challenging characters for me. And the 1940s to 1960 is the range of the dates. So you have that. One of them died in my lifetime.
Wow. So are you pulling your hair out in the process or are you done? Have you done it? You're in the hair pulling phase?
No, I'm waiting on copy edits and I just keep thinking, so copy edits, for those of you who don't know, you're going through and you're sort of moving commas around and you might be adding a word in here and there. I've got a huge list of things and I'm just going to just tweak a little bit, because this is the kind of book that feels like it needs it. So
especially with historical fiction, that's your last chance to make sure you have it all right.
Yes, no, absolutely.
At the same time, as you said, their children are still alive. Is that
Yes.
because you're not writing a biography? So you have to also give yourself that freedom as a writer of fiction to see where your characters are taking you, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm very
Okay.
nervous they're going to come after me, but what can you do?
Hard. It's hard. Challenging.
Oh, that's
So-
part of the adventure.
Mhm.
That means that we have to keep an eye on the catalogs for Heather's book, and Allison's hoping
Absolutely.
that means there's going to be a sequel to yours. But
Absolutely.
anyway, so we have a few questions here building off of what y'all were just talking about the research process itself. So Sharon asks about, what kind of volume of research did you do for each of your books? And then Susan asks a lot of questions in one, so we'll get to some of the others in a second. But one of the things she asked is, when you're trying to balance writing historical fiction, how do you decide when it's time, as she puts it, to put away, the research and actually start delving into the plot? Like, how do you walk that line between wanting to be faithful and true to your historical subjects, but not writing a biography, as Allison just said?
Mhm. Those are really great questions. Do you want to start, Heather?
I'll start and you can jump in. I front load. That's what I call it, front loading. And I'll read for a couple of months and just do really extensive reading and working on a historical outline. And usually I can tell when I'm done because I have already written out some character ideas. I have a synopsis written. I've got a pretty decent historical outline, and I have a first sentence. I can see the end, and I have a first sentence. And when I know the opening line of the book, I'm like, okay, it's time to stop with the research, and I write that opening line, and then I'm off to the races. That said, I do lots and lots of pausing to research, usually during my second draft, somewhat during my first, but I try not to. I try to kind of get the story down and then just leave parentheses along the way of things I need to look up. And then my second draft, I stop and I look up all those things and I layer in more. So what about you, Allison? Do you do something different?
Absolutely. No, I would say that is very similar too. And because my fiction is generally biographical fiction, and I know it's one woman's life, that gives me what I would say is the bones of the story. It's figuring out where I'm entering, at what point, but then that sort of supplies me with like the beginning, the end, the dates, and the key characters. And so I sort of see it as like, for the months that I'm researching and just reading as much as I can, or going to Hillwood or going to Top Ridge, it's like I'm putting all the ingredients, stuffing as much as I can into my brain. And then I hit a point where I know that it's just marinating and it's beginning to cook in there. And then my historical imagining of the character I reach a moment where she takes over from the character that I'm reading about on the page. She sort of comes to life. And so with this book, it was reading as much as I could about her life and the locales and the moments of her life, but then also having to read about all of the characters who were in her life, like her husbands, like her father, C.W. Post, like Clarence Birdseye, so there was a lot of research that was sort of ongoing throughout the whole process, but like Heather, I would describe it as front loading for sure.
Yeah, and also it's really different with writing fictional characters in a historic setting, because I've done both, and I do end up finding I research. I'm much more careful about my outlining when it's a real historical figure. When it's a fictional character, I'm much more immersed in sort of the movements of the day. The cultural norms, these kinds of things. Because if I'm not working on a true to life character, then I want to make sure that it's still incredibly immersive. That's really important. So.
I'm going to kind of combine two questions into one here. So this first part, Heather, applies a little more to your book, but the second one is for both of you. So an anonymous attendee said that they learned a lot while reading your book, Heather, and they were just wondering if you could clarify who was coming through Ellis Island. Was it only lower classes and steerage passengers? And then for both of you, related to that, Suzanne asked, what's the most interesting nugget of research that you found that you just couldn't quite find a way to squeeze into your book?
Yeah, so only third class went through Ellis Island. So your steamship would be coming in, and this was on the book, but it wasn't in great detail. So steamship would come in, and then they would send, as they got into the harbor, they would send a boat out to the steamship. All the officials would get on board, and they would basically check first class and second class passengers paperwork, give them a stamp. Then they would go back to shore. The steamship would go in and dock in Manhattan. They would not go to Ellis Island yet. First of all, because the waters are too shallow there and a steamship could not dock there. But second of all, because they wanted to let the first and second class passengers off. And then they would do a very quick preliminary check of third class and then board them on a ferry and send them out to Ellis Island. So it was only the third class that went through Ellis Island. And then I kind of forgot the second question.
Your most interesting little
most interesting.
Research. You just couldn't find a way to squeeze in there.
Yeah. Well, there was a ton, but to be very quick, there are all these ferries. One of them had a huge Italian anarchist riot. They were all headed to this picnic to one of the beaches there in New York. And great, a good day, but a lot of rumblings happening. You had Emma Goldman, who's stirring up the labor movement. And all these Italians got into a huge uproar. The captain docked, a bunch of people were arrested. That was initially in the book, and I ended up taking it out because it didn't work. And then there was another ferry called the General Slocum that was headed out to an island as well with all German American women and children for a church's picnic. And it caught fire and over 1,000 people died. And in fact, was considered the biggest New York City disaster until 9/11. But not that many people know about it. And I found that absolutely, of course, horrible, but also fascinating. But that happened in 1903, so it didn't really fit in my timeline. I tried, and it just did not work. And so that had to go too.
How do more people know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory than that?
I don't know. And they do. And I always find that interesting because when I discovered, it's called the General Slocum. So when I discovered this, and there's a whole book on it, and they have it at the Tenement Museum, I went and looked up all of the facts about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and I thought, wow, it has nowhere near the kind of human loss as the General Slocum ferry. And that ferry had so many problems. It had run aground. There were all these other horrible things that had happened to it. I can't believe they didn't put it out of commission. Yeah. But back then, they didn't have the sort of security checks that we do now. So, or safety checks and all that stuff. Wow. So isn't that amazing? I found that really shocking myself. Yeah.
I think you should write a book about it. It's pretty sad, but and then your nugget, or was that your nugget?
Those were definitely my nuggets. What's your nugget?
So my nugget, this is not in my book, but a personal nugget is my grandmother, who was the daughter of the Italian and Irish immigrant, opened the Tenement Museum, as a child immigrant, because she had grown up in the tenements.
Oh, wow. So that's so cool.
It's very meaningful to me, all of what you're talking about and what you wrote about. But my nugget, and it's in the book, but I could have gone more into it, as I was saying, like if I had been able to write 1,000 pages, is the fact that if you own a refrigerator or a freezer, or if you've ever had a cup of orange juice in the winter or a cup of instant coffee, then Marjorie Merriweather Post directly impacted your life. Because what I loved about her was that as her business was taking off and she was sort of always looking for ways to grow it, she said to her husband, I really want to go meet this fellow Clarence Birdseye and look into this Birdseye company he has. And the experts at the time, her husband and the other businessmen, thought it was really a foolish idea. And they said, nobody wants to own or buy frozen foods. Nobody wants to have a refrigerator in their home. No restaurant wants to serve food that's been refrigerated. And he said, no grocery store wants to have freezers and refrigerators. And Marjorie stuck to her guns and said, I really like this Clarence Birdseye. I really like this idea of frozen food. And in doing so, she just broke open this entire industry that affects all of us today. So I had to include that in the book, but I think that that's a nugget that very few people are aware of, in that this was Marjorie Merriweather Post directly impacting. This is a piece of her legacy. And I have a refrigerator in my home, so it affected me. And I just don't think people are aware of just the scope of her legacy.
That's amazing to me to think about, that someone would say, no one's going to want to put food that,
Yeah.
That
So
seems-
you would, she said, I'm telling you, the American woman wants this. If it saves her days, weeks of her life every year from having to can preserves, and if it gives the American family the opportunity to have food all year round, that is a fruit or a vegetable, then she's like, I'm telling you, Americans are ready for this. And the men did not see it, and she did. And so
good for her.
good for
Thank
her.
God.
And thanks to her. Yeah. Because I made frozen pizza tonight for my kids so I could come do this talk. So I have to thank Marjorie.
It reminds me of how I, only discovered a couple of years ago how involved Hedy Lamarr was in making what we have now as Wi-Fi. It's like all these amazing inventions that we owe to the women that came before us that we don't even remember. So that relates to Grace Ann's question. And hers is specifically about Ellis Island, but I think it points to a bigger thing too. So she asked, it seems that Ellis Island was talked about more when there were still people alive who had gone through, like when she was a kid in the 1970s. And she's just curious if you're familiar with the 1970s film called Hester Street. But I think that also points to the fact that Marjorie Post died in the 70s, right? So she wasn't, that's not that long ago, right? And yet somehow she's already kind of passed from most people's conscious memory. I mean, I'll admit, I went to Hillwood when I was in DC. I had a friend who interned there, and I didn't know it was her house until you just said, or until I, looked into the book. So it's even that, I thought it was a gorgeous, beautiful house, and I just didn't, quite make the connection. So how do you think, these things that are so, whether it's a really common experience, like the immigrant experience going through Ellis Island, or something like a prominent woman who didn't die too long ago, why do you think these things tend to pass out of memory so quickly?
I think there's a really beautiful quote, and I wish I could remember who said it, but it's basically, it goes something like, you keep people alive through memories of them. And I think the same is true with locations, with events. My kids were not alive during 9/11, so it doesn't have the same kind of impact on them as it did on me as a 20-something teacher in Connecticut, having, the announcement over the intercom and having ash covering my car and having students, sisters and brothers in the city, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that, there's our lives are big and they're long, and there's so many things that happen. And we all have our own experiences. I think it's really hard to, take it all in all the time and carry it to the next generation. And I think that's what's so great about writing historical novels, because we get to resurrect these memories in these really important places, and remind people that this is where you came from. This is who we are. This is why we are where we are. I think that's the beauty of historical fiction, whether it be a real character or a real event. With Ellis Island, it closed in the 80s. I think it was early 80s, late 70s. And, it just sort of fell out of the memory. And the same is true with World War I. We came around to the centenary, and then the last people passed away. And it's happening now with World War II. That's been so prominent in the HisFic community, but 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it might be this thing, this war that people don't talk about as much because it's not in the, in our immediate consciousness. That feels impossible to imagine, but it's true. It happens over and over again. It happens all the time. It happens every few years, So yeah, I think that's why. But I love that that's my job.
Yeah.
To bring that back, So.
Yeah, the forward march of time, as you're describing, Heather, and that's exactly the same reason why I love historical fiction so much, is because, like, for instance, Claire, you put such a fine point on it. You went to Hillwood, but it maybe did not bring her story to life in the way that when you read a novel where you are immersed in her heart and her mind, it comes to life in maybe a way that a really dry biography would not do for you if you're not a huge history nerd. Or maybe you wouldn't be drawn to read a really dry, long, daunting biography. But historical fiction is the genre and the experience that allows us to be in the private, homes and bedrooms and at the dinner table and having these conversations and feeling these emotions. And the best thing that a reader can say is that, after they read this novel, they just had to Google everything about the history. Or, Heather saying you want to go to Hillwood. If a historical fiction novel can inspire a deeper dive into history, then that is a gift. And that's a wonderful thing. And
then we've done our job, and it feels great, doesn't it?
and that's why, as a reader and a writer, it's the genre I love. It makes it come to life.
So to that effect, we have a question here from Carol about what are y'all's favorite literary journals? And I'm going to add on to that. What are you both reading right now? Besides Heather reading Allison's book.
Literary journals. I honestly, I don't really read them. I would say, I'll read like the New Yorker and things like that. But other than that, I'm always head in a book. Huge stacks of various genres, both in paperback, and I love audiobooks. I'm kind of obsessed with them right now because I can, while I'm driving or doing sports with my kids all over, being a chauffeur, or I'm cooking or cleaning, I listen. And so I'm getting through, 100 books a year now because of audiobooks, which I love. So I'm right in the middle of a book called Lucky. And it's by, I believe her name's Marissa Shipley, I think it is. It was actually a Reese Witherspoon pick. And it's about a con artist who ends up having this winning lotto ticket. And it's very fun and fast paced. Of course, I'm reading Allison's book too. And I just finished actually another suspense novel called The Lies I Tell by Julie Clark. And it's another con artist. I'm kind of on this con artist kick. I don't know why. I'm not one, I promise. But
and it's not research.
No, but Inventing Anna on Netflix kind of got me onto this kick, and now I just keep reading all these books. But I have a nice juicy stack of his fic that's coming up next. Marie Benedict's latest is among them. Her Hidden Genius. So
yeah. And so top of my stack is Marie Benedict. I'm getting an arc of hers, The Mitford Affair, that's not out yet. So I'm very excited to read that. And then I'm currently reading, I just finished yesterday, Where the Wandering Ends, which is a hisfic about the Greek Civil War. It's set on the island of Corfu, where the members we know of the British royal family, when Prince Philip was a member of the Greek royal family, it's his childhood and the story of
interesting.
When their family had to flee Greece. And he renounced his title and married Elizabeth. And that was really beautiful. That was by Yvette Corcoran. And then now I'm reading the new Anthony Dare, Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is just, he wrote, beautiful Pulitzer Prize winning All the Light We Cannot See. And now this one it's really different. It's got a bunch of different threads and timelines. And there's one that's set in space in the future. There's one that's set in Constantinople. And then there's some that are in Idaho in like the 70s. So it's interesting, but his writing.
He wanted to play with time, it sounds like, obviously, right?
And it's his language is just so beautiful. So it's not a quick read like what you were describing. It's a really dense read, but it's beautiful.
Well, I just added a few things to my list. I'm sure everyone else on the webinar did too. We're getting towards the end of our time tonight, so I apologize to everyone in the Q&A. We're not going to quite be able to get to everyone's, but this is a quick one. Are we going to see a movie or a TV show from either of your works? Have y'all heard anything yet?
Gosh, wouldn't that be amazing?
So I would love that. And not that I know of as of yet, but hey, I am holding out hope.
Right. So, it's the writer's dream, right? It's the best case scenario to see your story to come to life. I would love, somebody said, Marjorie's life is sort of like the American Crown, where you're looking at these historical moments, but through the life of this one woman. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to pitch it as that.
Love it.
Well, if anyone in the webinar tonight knows an agent, you just know who to direct them to now. Just to close tonight, there's a question about that, Heather, had you seen any parallels with the history that you were telling with the debates we're having about immigration today? And I'll extend that to you too, Allison. Is there anything that as you were writing and doing all of your research and uncovering this life that you saw parallels to our present day? Like, what about the stories that y'all were each telling made you feel like this is something that's really right to tell at this moment?
Yeah, I think, immigration is sort of always in the news, but of course it had really kind of come into its own again the last 5 or 6 years. I just think immigration is such an incredibly complex topic, and it's a really hard thing to figure out how to do well where everyone is served, and that's hard. And so when I did start my research, it was the same. I mean, the borders were open for a short period of time, but even then they had all these questions and all these stipulations. And so I think it's very relevant. And in fact, I found some of the headlines that I found in the research matched similar headlines in today's news. And that blew me away. And that was one reason why I decided to frame the story in the fictional newspaper articles that I wrote that are all based on articles I actually found. It's very relevant. It was shocking how much it was, in fact. So for better or worse,
Yeah. And I have been thinking about Marjorie so much the past few weeks, like even more than usual, even though I'm talking about her all the time, but she was coming of age and was living where women really were not all that empowered in society. It was a gradual journey for her to find her voice. And, she was the only heir of the post-empire, but she could never sit on the board of directors. It was always understood that it would be her husband and she would be kind of serving from behind the scenes, even though she was the brains always behind the operation. And it's not until we move further into the 20th century that a woman can take a seat at the table and she becomes a bigger leader and a more outspoken voice in business and across her life. So I've been thinking, were she alive today, I think we'd all want to vote for her for president. I want a bracelet that says, what would Marjorie do? Because she was just a natural leader and a good person and just a smart person and a capable person. But then I've been thinking about her because she was in the Soviet Union in the lead up to World War II. And there are just so many parallels that we're seeing to that frantic, scary, unknown time of the 1930s before the world, is sort of bracing for this war and now. And the relationship that she had in that really significant time in Moscow as a woman, as an American, as a capitalist, being trailed by, the precursors to the KGB. I've been thinking about her voice a lot and just sort of channeling her. And it seems very relevant to what's going on today with Russia and Ukraine. And just once again, the world watching this tragedy unfold and all of us watching it and seeing the tragedy. And then also just that anxiety that's now pervading the rest of the globe.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing that and just for taking the time this evening to spend it with us virtually. It was such a great conversation. I so appreciate both of you participating in Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series.
Thank you for having us. It's really great.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. And to everyone in the audience, I'm about to post a few links in the chat to tell you about some great upcoming events. We have some great resources on for Women's History Month. Of women in Atlanta. We have an exhibit coming up that's highly relevant to what we talked about today called Out of Many One, Portraits of America's Immigrants, which is just a really lovely dive into many immigrant stories. And to Allison's point at the end, we are hosting a virtual panel discussion on the war in Ukraine on April 4th at noon. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And lastly, 2 upcoming author talks, Ronnie Green next week, and another great new fresh fiction voice, and Gina Sathian is going to be discussing the paperback release of her book, Gold Diggers, which if you have not read is one of the most entertaining books that I read in the past.
I love the title already.
Yeah, it's great. It's like a great contemporary magical realism set in Atlanta. It's really fun.
Oh.
So she's a younger Atlanta writer. But Heather and Allison, thank you again. Thank you to everyone in the audience. I hope everyone has a lovely Friday and weekend, and we'll see you back here next time.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.